The morning Josephine Sullivan bought the last ticket on the mail coach from Harwick to Dunmore, she did not know that the man already seated inside had paid for 6. She found out the way you find out most things on a coach, by sitting in the space left behind after someone else has arranged the world to suit themselves. The Harwick coaching office smelled of tallow and damp wool, and the particular sourness of a room where travellers waited in various states of inconvenience. Josephine had been standing at the counter for nearly 4 minutes before the clerk looked up from his ledger. He was a thin man with ink on the second finger of his right hand, and a habit of closing his eyes slowly when he was about to deliver news he expected would be unwelcome. He closed them then. "One remaining seat," he said. "Single fare, the inside, rear-facing, far right position." He opened his eyes and looked at her steadily. "It is the only seat available on any departure before Thursday." Thursday was 5 days away. Josephine needed to reach Dunmore in time for her sister's confinement, and the letter she had received said the midwife believed it would be soon. She did not pause over the price, which was 2 shillings and 4pence, and represented most of what remained in her travelling purse. She counted the coins onto the clerk's counter with the flat efficiency of someone who has counted coins in front of strangers before, and long ago stopped minding the performance of it. The clerk issued the ticket. She folded it into the inside pocket of her brown wool jacket and stepped back into the morning. The coach itself was a large, well-maintained vehicle, its roof already loaded with 2 trunks and a leather portmanteau of significant size. A groom in a brown coat was strapping a 3rd trunk to the roof rack with the focused expression of a man engaged in geometry. The team of horses, 4 of them in matched bay, stood with the patient disengagement of animals that have made this journey many times and have ceased to find it interesting. What Josephine noticed most was the quantity of luggage relative to the apparent number of passengers. There was a lot of the first and very little of the second. She would understand this shortly. The inside of the coach held 6 seats, 3 forward-facing along the front bench, 3 rear-facing along the back. When Josephine stepped up and inside, 4 of the 6 seats were occupied entirely and exclusively by luggage. A hat box the circumference of a carriage wheel, a wicker basket with a buckled leather strap, a small rosewood writing case, a folded travelling rug of expensive thickness, placed over the forward centre seat with the careful positioning of something meant to discourage occupation. A woman sat in the forward window seat on the left. She was perhaps 50, wearing a dark green travelling coat with a velvet collar and a bonnet that had clearly been chosen to communicate something. She had the posture of someone who has been sitting in rooms where their opinion mattered for so long that the posture has become structural. She glanced at Josephine as she entered, and the glance was the particular kind that catalogues and categorizes in the same motion, filing the result immediately under a heading that does not invite revision. Josephine settled herself into the rear window seat, which was hers by the ticket's description, and set her small bag on the floor between her feet. The only other occupant of the coach, on the forward right window seat, was a man. He was perhaps 35, though it was difficult to be certain in the flat morning light. He wore a plain dark coat, well cut, and held a small book closed on his knee, with his thumb marking a page he had apparently stopped reading when she entered. He had the kind of face that gives you very little unless it chooses to, which is not the same as a face that gives nothing. His hands were still. His boots were good and clean in a way that suggested someone had cleaned them recently and carefully, though not lavishly. He looked at Josephine with a brief, level attention that was not scrutiny and not performance, and then he looked out the window. She noted him the way you note a lamp already lit in a room, as a fact, and a comfortable one. The groom shut the door. The coach moved. The first hour out of Harwick passed in the particular silence of people who do not yet know whether they will like one another and have decided, by unspoken agreement, to defer the question. The woman in the green coat, whose name Josephine would learn at the midday stop, was Dorothea Price, wife of a wool merchant of consequence, removed a small, leather-bound account of travels in Switzerland from her basket, and read it, with the visible intention of someone performing the act of reading for an audience of one. The man in the dark coat opened his book again and read it without any apparent intention at all, which is to say, he read the way people read when the book is the point. Josephine looked out the window. The country around Harwick was rolling and pale in the autumn light, the hedgerows running in long, irregular lines across the fields, the occasional farmhouse sitting back from the road with the stoical permanence of something that has no intention of going anywhere. She found it calming, the rhythm of it. The coach swayed slightly on the road's uneven surface. The horses' hooves were a steady percussion beneath the wheels. She thought about her sister, about the letter's careful understatement, about the particular courage required to write, "The midwife believes it will be soon," without writing the fear that lives inside that sentence. When the coach stopped at the Crossroads Inn at Brentfield for the midday change of horses and a meal break of 40 minutes, Josephine was last to descend, having waited for the luggage arrangement inside to be navigated without incident. She came out into a courtyard yard of packed gravel and 3 other coaches in various states of preparation, and walked toward the inn's door at the same moment that Dorothea stopped walking and turned to address her. "I must say," Dorothea began, with the tone of someone who has been composing the sentence for approximately 50 miles. "The positioning of the seat tickets this season has become quite careless. A rear-facing single is hardly appropriate alongside reserved seating." She looked at Josephine's coat, particularly on the Dunmore route. There were 4 other people within hearing distance. A stout man in a commercial coat who had ridden outside on the roof and was flexing his cold fingers. 2 women from the second coach who had paused to adjust a child's bonnet. The groom. They all occupied slightly different postures of not quite listening, which is the posture of people who are listening. Josephine looked at Dorothea steadily for a moment. "The Dunmore route was convenient for my journey," she said. "I hope the change of horses goes quickly. The road past Brentfield is meant to be rough." She said it without coldness and without apology, which was the only register she knew for conversations that wanted to become something else. Then she went inside. The inn served a tolerable mutton broth and bread still warm from the morning bake, and Josephine ate at the end of a long table near the window while the room moved and shifted around her. She watched Dorothea hold court at the table's better end, speaking to the commercial traveller, in the way that people speak when they are constructing a version of themselves for a new audience. References to the merchant's house, to the social obligations in Dunmore, to the quality of certain families along the route. Josephine did not watch her with malice. She watched her the way you watch weather, noting what it was doing and where it seemed to be going, without particular investment in either. Outside, when she stepped into the courtyard after eating, the air had dropped to something genuinely cold. The horses were already in harness for the next stage. A woman sat on the wooden bench along the inn's outer wall, elderly and thin-shouldered, wearing a black wool coat that had been good once and was now too light for what the afternoon was becoming. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her chin tucked slightly forward, which is the posture of someone conserving warmth. Josephine wore a travelling cloak over her jacket. It was a serviceable garment, plain brown, lined with a wool flannel that had been her mother's practical thinking rather than her own, and it was doing its work adequately. She sat on the bench beside the woman, took off the cloak, set it around the woman's shoulders. "It's getting cold earlier than it should this year," Josephine said. The woman looked at her. Her eyes were pale and very clear. "You'll be cold yourself, child." "The coach is warm enough," Josephine said, which was not quite true and was not quite a lie. "Keep it until we depart." She did not look toward the inn door. If she had, she might have seen the man from the forward seat standing in the doorframe with his book still in one hand and a cup of something in the other, watching her with the expression of someone who has just been given an answer to a question he had not known he was asking. The coach was not particularly warm. She sat in her jacket for the remaining miles to the overnight stop at Margaret Finch's inn at Summerwell, and she was cold in the way that becomes background noise after a while, persistent and unremarkable, something to be waited through. Dorothea, by contrast, had retrieved her folded travelling rug from the coach's centre seat and arranged it across her lap, with the economical satisfaction of someone who plans well and approves of themselves for it. She said nothing to Josephine for the remainder of the afternoon's drive. She looked out the window on her side and occasionally made a sound that was not quite a word when the road made the coach lurch. The man across from Josephine had put his book away after Brentfield and appeared to be looking at nothing in particular outside his window, with the focused vacancy of someone whose attention has gone somewhere inside. Once, when the road tilted sharply on a long curve and Josephine reached for the door handle to steady herself, he lifted one hand slightly from his knee, a small automatic gesture of someone prepared to be useful. The road levelled, and the gesture never became anything. He lowered his hand. She noticed it, filed it, said nothing. They arrived at Summerwell as the light was going. The inn sat at the edge of the village square, a wide stone building with a signboard, a stable entrance, and the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat coming from its upper windows. Its proprietor, Margaret Finch, came out to meet the coach with the composed efficiency of a woman who has run a good house for 20 years and sees every kind of traveller without being unsettled by any of them. She was perhaps 45, with strong hands and an expression that was warm without being deferential, which Josephine liked immediately. "Josephine Sullivan," Margaret said, coming around the side of the coach as the passengers descended. Josephine blinked. "Yes?" "Your sister wrote ahead, bless her. She said to put you in the corner room with the good feather bed, and to tell you she has the better midwife this time." Margaret gave her a brief, frank look. "Come in. You've been cold all afternoon. Anyone can see it." Josephine followed her, surprised and unexpectedly grateful, the way you are when kindness arrives without your having arranged for it. The inn's public room had a fire that meant business. High-backed settles flanked the hearth on both sides, and the long tables were already laid for the evening meal. 3 men from the second coach occupied one table with the settled posture of people who have dined here before. The commercial traveller from the roof was thawing his hands over the fire. Dorothea swept past the common room and was shown directly to the private parlour she had apparently arranged in advance, which she did with the brisk conviction of someone who views public spaces as temporary, unfortunate conditions. Josephine took the near settle by the fire and let herself be warm. The man from the coach came in perhaps 10 minutes later. He stood for a moment in the doorway, looked at the room, and then settled himself at the far end of the same settle in the unhurried way of someone choosing a position for sensible rather than social reasons. Margaret brought him something hot without being asked, which suggested a prior acquaintance. He set it on the broad arm of the settle and looked at the fire. Josephine had been thinking about her sister and the midwife, and the long road still left tomorrow, and she had reached the particular kind of tired that sits behind the eyes and makes everything slightly more apparent than normal. She was not inclined to conversation. She did not think he was either. It was pleasant, this shared quietness. There was something in it that was different from the silence of strangers sharing a coach, which is an absence. This had a texture to it. The fire worked between them, and the room made its sounds around them, and there was no performance required of either. After some time, without looking away from the fire, he said, "Your cloak was a practical sacrifice." She considered that. She was cold. "Yes," he said. He looked at her then briefly. It was a good judgment. She did not know what to say to this exactly, so she said, "I had the jacket." Something altered very slightly in his face. Not a smile in the full sense, but the particular thing that happens just before one. She looked back at the fire. "You travel this route often?" "Often enough," he said. It was the smallest sufficient answer, and he offered it without apology, which she respected. She tried once more from genuine curiosity rather than obligation. "What takes you to Dunmore?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the horses were being moved from the courtyard to the stable, and the sound of hooves on cobblestone came through the walls in a muffled, steady rhythm. "A regular accounting," he said at last. "I keep appointments there periodically." She nodded, accepting this as the shape of an answer a private person gives when the true one is not available, and asked nothing more. He stayed for another hour at the fire's end. When he finally rose to go, he picked up his cup, which was empty, and said without ceremony, "Good evening, Miss Sullivan." He had used her name. She had not introduced herself to him. She turned, but he was already through the door at the back of the room, and she was left with the small, strange weight of that fact, and the fire, and the evening arranging itself around her in the ordinary way of evenings. Her room was, as promised, the corner room with a good feather bed and a window that looked out on the stable yard. She washed her face, unpinned her hair, and sat for a while at the small writing table before the window. The yard below was dark except for the light from the stable's half door, where a lamp burned. She did not immediately hear the voices. They came through the partition wall between her room and the private parlour. Not clearly at first, a murmur, the kind that suggests conversation without delivering it. She would have let it stay a murmur. She was not the sort of person who pressed her ear to walls or strained toward things that were not her business. She was setting out her things for morning, when one sentence came through with the particular clarity that thin plaster and dry winter air sometimes produce, without her seeking it. "She is no one," Dorothea Price said, to what was presumably her husband, who had apparently joined the coach party at some point Josephine had not registered. "A woman travelling alone with one bag on a single fare. Nobody of consequence sends you forward alone with one bag. You can see it." A pause. A lower voice that Josephine could not make into words. "No," Dorothea said. "She doesn't matter. Nobody who counts will know her in Dunmore. If they did, she wouldn't be on a public coach with a single rear-facing ticket." Another pause. "I am telling you because I want you to understand," Dorothea said, and now her voice was moving, as if she had crossed the room, "that I am not being cruel. I am being accurate. There is a difference." Then the voices dropped back to murmur and stayed there. Stayed. Josephine sat with her hands flat on the table. The lamp on the writing desk made a small circle of light on the wood. Outside, the stable lamp was still burning. She could hear faintly one of the horses shifting in a stall. She had known, of course. She had known from the first glance in the coach, from the Brentfield courtyard, from the tone of the sentence about rear-facing seats. She had known with the plain, factual knowledge of someone who has been read that way before, and has learned to carry it at a useful distance, the way you carry a persistent cold, acknowledged, accommodated, not allowed to determine your plans. Knowing a thing and hearing it said plainly through a wall at night are different experiences. Her hands were still on the table. She looked at them for a moment. then moved them to her lap. She thought about her sister. She thought about the road tomorrow and the midwife's estimate and the particular quality of a confinement room in the early morning when everything hangs between one thing and another. She went to bed. She slept, which she thought of afterward as a small private victory. In the morning, the coaching yard was lit with the particular hard clarity of early autumn, air cold and completely still, the sky above the stable roof a pale grey going toward blue. Josephine was down before most of the other passengers, dressed and carrying her bag, her breath making brief clouds in the cold air. She had come down 20 minutes before she needed to, because she had been awake since first light, and lying still was beginning to cost her more than moving. At the counter inside the coaching office, a small attached room off the inn's entrance hall, a young woman was issuing departure documents with the brisk focus of someone who has done this task before full waking. A family, the father in a heavily mended coat and the mother holding a child at her hip, stood at the counter in the particular posture of a private difficulty encountered in a public place. The father was speaking in a low, controlled voice. The clerk, who was not Margaret but a younger woman, was looking at the ledger with the expression of someone who would help if she could and cannot. Josephine, waiting her turn, heard the shape of it without intending to. The coach going north, departing in 40 minutes. The family's berth paid in part, the remainder outstanding. 14 shillings short of the full amount. The father saying something about the week's business not having settled. The clerk's face saying, with actual sympathy, that the departure time was fixed and she had no authority over the ledger. Josephine waited until the father had finished speaking. She set her bag down. "Excuse me," she said to the clerk. "This family's passage. What's the remainder?" The clerk looked at her. 14 shillings, miss." Josephine opened her travelling purse. It had been thin after yesterday's fare and the previous day's provisions on the road. What she counted onto the counter was essentially everything in it, the last of what she had allocated for contingency. She counted it out in front of the family, who had gone very still. The father started to speak, the kind of objection that costs more than the thing itself to voice. "The road north is cold this time of year," Josephine said, looking at the child, who was perhaps 3, and was watching her with the enormous solemnity that small children bring to everything they don't yet understand. "You should all be inside." The clerk recorded the payment. The father did not say what he had started to say. He said, very quietly, "God bless you, miss," and the family moved toward the yard. Josephine was putting her now empty purse away when she became aware, by some small change in the weight of the room, that someone was standing in the doorway. She did not look up immediately. She adjusted the clasp on her bag, and then she looked up. The man from the coach was standing in the doorway with his coat on and his hat in his hand. He was watching her with an expression she did not have a ready word for. Level and warm and absolutely still, the way a room is still when the fire has just been lit and nothing has had time to move yet. "The coach will be ready in a quarter hour," he said. "I know," she said. He held the door for her. She went through. The yard had gathered its population. The roof passengers were loading their own bags. The groom was checking the near-side horse's harness with the focused attention of someone who does not leave that particular task to chance. Dorothea had emerged from the inn and was stationed near the coach door, speaking to her husband, who had the compressed posture of a man who has been travelling with his wife long enough to have learned when contribution is not required. Dorothea's husband was a wide, tired-looking man named, Josephine would eventually learn, Mr. Edmund Price, who had arrived the previous evening on a hired gig from the Somerwell branch of his wool business, and would continue with the party to Dunmore. He stood now in the way of a man who is present, because that is what is required. From the stable entrance, a man in a leather working apron came into the yard with the particular directness of someone going toward a specific destination. He was the stable master, a broad man of 50-odd years, with the kind of face that has spent most of its life outdoors. He was making for the man from the coach, and he arrived before anyone else had properly settled. "Mr. Hart," he said, and his voice was the carrying kind. "Mr. Callum Hart. The team for the Dunmore continuation is the Bay 4 you asked for last month. All 4 in good order. I've held them as you specified. You'll have a fast run today if the road past Tilburn hasn't gone soft overnight." He said this with the casual familiarity of a man who is used to making reports and knows exactly to whom he is making them. The yard did what yards do when something significant has just been announced inside them. It became very briefly still. Callum said, "Thank you, Dawes. The road looked dry coming in last evening." He said it in exactly the same tone he had used to say everything else, which was the tone of a man who does not perform surprise that his own information has become known. Dorothea had stopped speaking mid-sentence. Josephine, standing 2 steps from the coach door with her bag, looked at Dawes, then at Callum, with the particular attention of someone catching up to a fact that has apparently been present the whole time. "Mr. Hart," Dawes continued, undisturbed, patting the side of the coach. "The new spring mechanism on the rear axle is holding well. You'll want to note it when Ambrose gives you the report. He was pleased with it." Callum nodded once. "Good." Mr. Price, behind Dorothea, said very quietly, "Did he say Callum Hart?" Dorothea said nothing. "Of the Hart Coaching Company," Mr. Price said, lower but not low enough. "Edmund, that's Callum Hart. His family bought the Western and Midland routes 3 years ago." He paused. "He owns this coach." Dorothea turned very slightly to look at her husband with the expression of a person who has heard something and is working out what it costs. Callum walked to where the stable master was standing, and they spoke for a few minutes in the way of 2 men reviewing something specific and practical, neither performing anything for the audience behind them. He spoke about the axle and the team and the road conditions with the clear knowledge of someone to whom these details belong in the most direct possible sense. When he came back to the coach, the yard had resumed its ordinary activity, but with the particular quality of resumed activity that comes after a pause. Everyone doing what they were doing before, but doing it with the slightly heightened consciousness of people who have just received new information and are quietly integrating it. Dorothea was standing at the coach door. Her hand was on the frame. She was wearing the expression of a woman in the process of revising a document that turned out to contain significant errors, and finding the process uncomfortable, Callum stopped beside Josephine. "I wrote to the innkeeper at Dunmore," he said conversationally, as if continuing a discussion that had been interrupted rather than beginning one. "Margaret sent word ahead to her sister there. Your sister's house is 12 minutes from the inn on Barrow Street. The innkeeper will know it." Josephine looked at him. The morning light was that particular clear quality that comes with cold air and a sky making up its mind. She looked at him, and then she said, carefully, "You've been in correspondence with Margaret Finch on my behalf?" "She wrote to me, actually," he said. "She said there was a passenger on today's continuation that she wished looked after, given the circumstances of the journey." This was, Josephine understood, a compression of something larger into its smallest sufficient form, which was by now clearly how this man operated. "That was presumptuous," she said. "It was," he agreed. He did not apologize. She waited, but nothing further came. She said, "You own the coaching line." "My family does," he said. "I manage the Midland routes." "And the 6 seats." He looked at her. "A habit of privacy," he said. "I travel often. I find it useful to have some control over the proximity." She thought of the hat box the circumference of a cartwheel, the rosewood writing case, the travelling rug positioned across the centre seat. "And yet," she said, with the smallest possible degree of dryness. He considered that. "The arrangement has occasionally resulted in circumstances I did not anticipate," he said. She was quite certain from the quality of the stillness around his mouth that this was the closest he came to expressing that the arrangement had resulted in her. Behind them, Dorothea Price had moved away from the coach door and was standing very near her husband, speaking in a voice that was lower than it had been at any point since Harwick. Edmund Price was listening with the patient expression of a man who has been in commerce long enough to understand that the recalibration of assessments is a regular part of the work. Margaret came out of the inn's side door, wiping her hands on her apron, and looked at the yard with the comprehensive assessment of someone who runs a good house and likes to know the state of things. She caught Josephine's eye and gave her a brief, warm nod, the kind that means simply good. Josephine stepped up into the coach. The step was the same wooden step it had been yesterday, worn smooth in the centre, but Callum's hand was at the rail beside it, not touching her, simply there, the way a hand can be present as a fact rather than a gesture. She settled into her seat. Callum came in after her and settled across the way, in his forward right window seat, with his book closed on his knee and his hands still. The morning light came through the window on his side, clean and flat, and lit the small creases at the corner of his eye. The Prices entered and took their seats. Dorothea arranged herself at her window with slightly less certainty of execution than she had managed yesterday. She did not look at Josephine, and she did not look at Callum, which was itself a form of looking. The groom closed the door. Dawes called something from the yard that was about the road and the time and the weather, and Callum acknowledged it through the window with one raised hand that was the gesture of a man who trusts his staff and does not need to manage them. The coach moved, past the stable and the signboard, and the lane that ran between Somerwell's last two houses and out into the open country, the bare hedges running past in the morning light, the road unrolling ahead in its particular way of promising a long, pale thread toward somewhere. Josephine looked out her window. After a time, without looking away from his side of the glass, Callum said, "The cloak." She turned. "You should have it back," he said. He reached into the travelling bag at his feet, the plain leather bag that had sat there the whole journey without her ever noticing what it contained, and he produced the brown wool cloak, neatly folded. Dawes recovered it from the bench last evening. Margaret kept it. I told her I would return it. Josephine took the cloak. It was folded with a precision that was not her own, a crispness that someone had made of it deliberately, as if the folding were a form of care. She set it across her lap. "She was warm enough," Josephine said, "when I looked back from the coach door." "Yes," he said, "she was." He looked at her then with the full attention he had been largely withholding for 2 days, and it was not like being appraised. It was quieter than that. It was the look of someone who has been waiting to confirm a thing they already knew, and finding the confirmation exactly as they expected, and being satisfied, and not needing to say so. Josephine looked back at him. The morning country rolled past outside both windows, the hedges and the fields, and the pale October sky, and the coach made its good, steady progress on the road to Dunmore, and neither of them said anything more for a long while. There was no need. Dorothea sat in her corner with the travelling rug across her lap, and looked out at the road with the expression of a woman whose accountings are still in progress. The coach carried them all forward at the same pace, which is what coaches do, and make no distinction. At Dunmore, the inn on Barrow Street was exactly where Callum had said it would be. The innkeeper, A broad woman with the same direct warmth as Margaret came out at the sound of the wheels with a knowing look already on her face. "Miss Sullivan," she said before Josephine had fully descended, "your sister is asking for you. Has been since first light." Josephine moved. She did not run, because the road was cobbled and her bag was in her hand, and there are certain urgencies that do not need speed to be urgent. She walked fast, and with purpose down Barrow Street, and turned where the innkeeper pointed and came to the narrow house with the green door, and knocked and was let in. She will not describe what happened in that house over the next hours. That is a different story and a private one. But at some point in the middle of it, after the midwife had done her work and the room had settled into that particular exhausted peace that follows arrival, Josephine stepped out to the front step for air. The afternoon had come on. The street was quiet. At the far end of the road, where it widened toward the coaching inn, there was a figure standing with a horse, not waiting for anything, apparently, just standing. He had his hat in his hand and his face turned toward the sky, and then he turned it toward the street, and he saw her. She lifted one hand, a small gesture. He made the same one back. She went inside. On the step where she had been standing, she had left her cloak, the brown wool one, neatly folded, that had made its whole journey and come back. She had meant to take it inside, and had forgotten it. She looked at it when she came back out an hour later, the step empty now and the light going soft and orange over the rooftops, and she picked it up, and she pressed it once against her chest, the wool rough and warm and completely familiar, and went back inside to where her sister was, and where she was needed.